CEO John Riccitiello is about to have a conference call on the performance of EA in the third quarter of fiscal year 2008. They're the largest video game publisher in America, the biggest spenders, the biggest earners, and to their army of shareholders, John would describe the company's performance as solid, but mixed. It turns out that would be a good way to describe the entire financial year. The usual hitters like FIFA and Madden came out swinging, however just didn't swing quite as hard as they'd hoped, while also increasing spending. The story internally was that this was effectively a setup year. They'd spent a huge amount restructuring the company, and alone spent a high 9 figures to acquire the company who owned BioWare and Pandemic, giving them a new safe home. It was spending a lot now to increase revenue later, an investment into the future. This however wasn't exactly the standard performance for EA. 2008 comes after a string of multi-million years of profit, and come the end of the year, for the second time since publicly trading, would report a loss of $454 million. For as bad as this might look, it's far from a critical blow for the company. A loss this heavy might flush away 2 years of profit without outweighing the profit of either 2005 or 2004 by themselves. While these losses are nowhere near sustainable, EA was eager to point out the growing potential market, and an increase in revenue means positioning themselves for higher market share for greater profitability later down the line. In a speculative future, this is all fair, though compared to the companies around them in the there and then, they were an anomaly of underperformance. Activision, $344 million in profit. Take-Two, $97 million in profit, and that's coming off of 2 years of heavy losses. Ubisoft, European, inherently winning. Even THQ didn't lose a tenth of what EA lost, and look at them now. EA had the benefit of enormous growth in the years prior, so even with a subtle downtrend over the last couple of years, this was set up to be a fluke. 2009, which for EA started April 1st, 2008 and ended March 31st, 2009, was going to be different, and with releases like Dead Space, FIFA 09, and Spore, surely it couldn't be that bad. Over the course of 12 months, EA would finish 2009 with a net income of 1.1 billion in losses. There's one glaring event that took place in those 12 months, the financial crisis of 2008. The effect of the financial crisis was so widespread to impact essentially every industry. In the case of games, the issue landed on consumers, who had luxury spending ripped from their table of choices. Unemployment was on the rise, decreasing the household income, and that's if the consumer even had a house. As the effects of the financial crisis were unfolding, people who were still employed would be naturally reluctant to spend under the circumstance that they might soon find themselves out of a job. Now, as John would point out in their second quarterly report, the games industry has been very resilient in past recessions, and while this is true, EA might have overestimated how true that was. As an industry, games hadn't, and still haven't, been around for a long time. And while the American economy had suffered a similar downturn from 2000 to 2001 as the dot-com bubble burst and unemployment shot up over the course of several months, the financial crisis of 2008 was much more widespread. To compare this to the future, without the free-to-play model that gets people through the door, along with loot boxes and battle passes that encourage small payments over a long period of time, the initial price to purchase was just too high. While John might be right when defending the value a game has to a consumer when he says, a single $60 game can deliver 50 to 100 hours of play, a far better consumer value than a trip to the movies or a live music or sports event. Someone who's recently unemployed or at threat of being made redundant is thinking about that initial payment, rather than a value over time calculation. This assumed position of strength and a lack of caution surrounding the environment they were in might have put EA in a bad spot. However, it wasn't a uniquely bad position. Activision was weird in that it had just finished a merger with Blizzard and miraculously still profited to the tune of $113 million. Take-Two lost $100 million. THQ, however, despite losing half as much, did end up like the USG Ishimura. Spoilers for Dead Space, by the way. However, the fact that one company could bleed $500 million, end up bankrupt in 3 years' time, and the other could bleed a whole rack and change, and in the same time period end up making SSX like nothing had happened, shows that the problem is more complicated than raw numbers. THQ's heavy losses come off of the top of a net revenue of $800 million, so the loss represents roughly 52% of the company's spending. For every dollar put in, they saw half a dollar back. EA, on the other hand, not only had a larger portion of the market to draw from, they also had much higher revenue to begin with. On revenue of $4.2 billion, the losses only represent 26% of the spending. And while EA was a larger company, it was the way that they were a larger company that acted as a double-edged sword. THQ was operating on the 7th generation of consoles like a 6th generation company, a focus on high-quantity licensed games, with the occasional franchised title to act as a hit. Licensed games were the backbone keeping the company afloat, and risky hits were in the realm of substantial profit, with retailers being the reliable and infinite fridge that sustained their sales. The issue is that, outside of Saints Row 2, their hits weren't hitting as gaming trends were shifting. The casual market that licensed games thrived off of soon wouldn't exist. When the financial crisis hit, retailers would have felt the impact most immediately. In a physical media-driven environment, they would have noticed it becoming more difficult to empty their inventory for new products, purchasing less from everyone while also purchasing more of what they can guarantee to shift, of which THQ wasn't a part of. The financial crisis crippled THQ, but it was their inability to change in the coming years that would lead them to bankruptcy. EA instead either saw a lot of these issues coming or were more eager to diversify. They'd still put out games in the same vein, however had the funds from years prior to experiment. For example, while THQ's business model relied heavily on retailers to act as a middleman between them and the consumer, EA was experimenting with direct-to-consumer products more and more. Both companies would have had their games on digital storefronts, however EA put greater emphasis on DLC and microtransactions like FIFA Ultimate Team or Dead Space's additional suits. This direct-to-consumer practice would help to offset some of EA's losses when retailers started dialing back. In fact, there's an alternate universe where this is really good for EA. If everyone who might have been interested in their games purchased them directly from digital storefronts, they would have seen higher returns and reduced the effectiveness of the second-hand market. Unfortunately for EA, for many console users, the digital purchase concept was new, and Xbox in specific using their Microsoft points system added friction to the purchasing process, making already lower than usual sales even worse. This isn't to mention how physical media was still open to whoever owned the disc, so the secondhand market, which was typically cheaper, was more appealing in economically strained times. A dependency on retailers and what was becoming an outdated business model led a company like THQ with a massive cash loss. EA might have been in a slightly better position to handle retailers giving up, making them slightly cash flow positive, however when compared to the previous year, was a huge bump in the road. This loss in income, mostly unforeseeable from historic trend, became a huge problem in regards to budgeting. They massively increased marketing that year, while also, as was the trend, increasing research and development. This over-budgeting, right before a huge financial downturn, contributed a couple $100 million to their losses. In retrospect, it's a colossal fumble, an overreach of assumed infinite growth, but also a result of impacts much wider than the company could have seen coming. A vain attempt at infinite growth had its issues exacerbated by how they were trying to achieve that infinite growth. EA, while not against hiring directly, foamed at the mouth to acquire another company. Between the year 2000 and 2008, they had acquired not 3 or 4 companies, but 15. Many of these acquisitions make sense. Criterion was purchased at $68 million as Acclaim was burning to the ground before anyone could swallow up the team with all the talent. And DreamWorks Interactive was purchased along with the Medal of Honor franchise as DreamWorks was losing faith in a gaming division for what is now a very measly predicted $10 million. Those acquisitions wouldn't stay cheap for long, and while some of those acquisitions have never had disclosed amounts, when EA acquired VG Holding Corp for Pandemic and BioWare in 2007, it cost $682 million, which is excluding a $30 million loan to them prior to this point, not to mention now having to support 800 additional staff. Some of what was paid for here was very practical. They have to pay for the staff, they have to pay for the buildings they might occupy, and they have to pay for the rights for the intellectual property. However, the value of all of those things was grossly outweighed by Goodwill. Goodwill is, in effect, the premium a company pays with the expectation that, within some time period, that revenue will be returned by the companies purchased. Despite $400 million being an absurd amount to you and I, CFO Warren Jensen would argue otherwise, expecting $600 million back in just 2 years' time. This was before they could see the damage that was produced by the financial crisis, at which point many investments had to be reevaluated. The VG Holding Corp buyout was too soon to judge. They hadn't long been purchased, so their value to the company was still to be seen. What could be judged, however, was Jamdat. Some of you might know the game Doom RPG. It was a dungeon crawler version of Doom made for flip phones. I'd imagine very few have ever heard of its publisher, Jamdat. They were extremely early to the mobile entertainment craze. While others were trying to shovel garbage onto the Game Boy and DS, Jamdat's focus was on your Motorola, and EA could see why. It was an industry that was expanding rapidly, and as BlackBerry was rising in popularity, accelerating the speed in which the technology improved, a market around digital accessories was carving out. The path in which the humble gooner is a slave to MiHoYo's lottery was paved by a millennial paying $1 for the crazy frog ringtone. Naturally, being an emerging market, EA wanted to position themselves early in the likely event that the market became a growth opportunity, and while they could invest their own resources, it would be quicker to absorb an already existing company, while also removing them as potential competition. In the here and now, we can see this as a great long-term play, but when EA paid $700 million for them in late 2005, it was entirely too early. Keep in mind the iPhone, where the App Store and marketplaces for phones allowed apps and the free-to-play model to take off, wouldn't come around until 2007, so what Jamdat was able to offer in the time between 2005 and 2009 isn't as widespread as it is today. Initially, the Goodwill paid for Jamdat came to a total of $495 million, substantially higher than the game studios that they had acquired. While most game studios were purchased with Goodwill doubling their current assets, Jamdat was acquired with almost 10 times the value. Goodwill as an asset, though, can be re-evaluated later if, say, there was shock economic downturn that might make it so that that goodwill might never come to fruition. If an acquisition has failed to make its money back within a reasonable time frame, that goodwill is recalculated based on what was paid and what was made, written down as goodwill impairment. Needless to say, Jamdat, having been overpurchased in the short term and not giving the environment to capitalize in the long term, hadn't done great. $368 million marked down in goodwill impairment. The specifics of how they came to this number aren't provided. They could, in theory, have used goodwill from other companies that they had acquired to come to this number. However, the only company that was ever mentioned when discussing the impairment was Jamdat. The loss is rough, however it should be noted for what it is. It's a book loss rather than a cash loss. If you bought a car at $10,000 and 3 years later it was worth $2,000, that doesn't mean that you've lost the car. If EA wanted to be purchased by another company, it had lost that money in value, but without that on the table, nothing had practically disappeared. They still had all of the staff, all of the IP, all of the resources that went into running that arm of the company. Over budgeting and goodwill impairment alone, though, had them down $600 million. And from there, pockets of markdowns and payments accumulate. A couple of tens of millions here and there, you know, chump change, and a heavy increase on income tax. And come the end of it, you're looking at $1 billion in loss. They didn't lose $1 billion because of a big bad wolf meddling with the books, it was the fault of assumed infinite growth and economic downturn. As hubris smashed into reality, the crater that it left in the company's balance sheet ultimately meant little. It wasn't a sign that something was wrong, it was just a new space to build. There is one element that's still left: restructuring. The result of both the economic environment and EA's business mistiming led to the stock tanking. It had mainly done so in the holiday period of 2008, when it went from $45 a share in September to $15 in December. The cascade of catalysts, the environment, the stock, and the company's results led to heavy restructuring costs. $80 million to be exact, just to act as a little cherry on top. However, when you break that down, what it really meant was 1,100 talented people were now unemployed, many of them broken off from their income for factors completely completely out of their control. Pandemic was acquired in 2007 and by 2009 were reduced to nothing, all 200 of their employees looking for work. The rest are ghosts in the data. In their financial report, EA was laying off 11% of their workforce. And if this didn't feel enough like burning the people that made their profit margin, in 2010 they would reduce their workforce by a further 1,200 to save $100 million a year, while buying up Playfish for $400 million to make trash for Facebook. The $80 million in restructuring pushed EA just ever so slightly deeper into the billion territory. However, for the employees left behind, the stock price and the bottom line wouldn't have mattered. For them, it would be wondering where the next paycheck comes from, and for the employees still left, if they were next. For John Ricciatello, however, this was an opportunity to provide his entourage of higher-ups a pay increase, as retention incentive, so they wouldn't take their skills somewhere else. In many ways, people might have found EA's billion-dollar fumble cathartic, more so now as they represent the worst in business-to-consumer relationships. However, when a company missteps, the people that it hurts the most are often the people that care the most. True harm isn't felt by those at the top of the corporate pyramid who oversee the product, it's felt by those who work their hardest to make the art.